In July 1944, the island of Saipan entered its final days. What had begun as a battle for control of the Pacific was ending in one of the most devastating scenes of the war. Japanese forces had been pushed into the northern end of the island. Defensive lines were collapsing, supplies were nearly gone, thousands of soldiers and civilians had nowhere left to retreat. But surrender was not the plan. Years of propaganda and military doctrine had created a terrifying belief that capture was worse than death itself. As American forces advanced closer, entire groups began moving toward the cliffs at the edge of the island. Soldiers, families, children. Over the next 3 days, Saipan became the scene of one of the most disturbing final chapters of the Pacific War. More than 30,000 lives would be lost, not in a final battle, not in a last charge, but at the edge of the cliffs. Before we continue, if you enjoy real World War II, stories told through research and documentary-style storytelling, consider subscribing. More battles, forgotten operations, and untold stories are coming. Now, to understand how Saipan reached its final days, we need to go back to where it started. By the summer of 1944, the Pacific War had entered a different phase. The United States had spent nearly 3 years advancing across thousands of miles of ocean, fighting through islands transformed into heavily defended Japanese positions. Each operation carried the same objective: move closer to Japan itself. But the closer American forces advanced, the more difficult the battles became. Saipan was not simply another island in that chain. Located within the Mariana Islands, Saipan occupied a position military planners considered strategically critical. Unlike many earlier objectives, capturing Saipan offered something different: distance. The island sat close enough to place Japan's home islands within range of American long-range bombers. Airfields constructed there would allow the United States to launch direct attacks against the Japanese mainland without relying on distant bases far across the Pacific. For American planners, that changed everything. The island itself stretched roughly 12 miles in length and only a few miles across at its widest point. On maps, it looked manageable. Reconnaissance photographs showed beaches suitable for landings, road networks, and terrain that appeared difficult but far from impossible. Naval bombardment plans had already been prepared. Landing zones had been selected. Troop deployments were finalized. But maps rarely explained what soldiers eventually faced once they stepped onto the ground. Saipan contained sugar plantations, rocky ridges, hills, caves, cliffs, and dense vegetation capable of slowing movement across almost every section of the island. Northern areas became increasingly difficult terrain, with elevated positions providing defenders wide fields of fire over any advancing force below. Japanese commanders understood the value of that terrain immediately. For Japan, Saipan represented more than territory. Losing the island meant exposing the home islands themselves to direct strategic bombing. Military planners considered Saipan part of what they described as an absolute defense zone, positions considered too important to abandon without severe consequences for the empire's future. Thousands of Japanese troops had already been stationed there. Defensive positions expanded across the island. Caves were reinforced. Weapons and supplies were hidden throughout the terrain wherever concealment allowed. Heavy machine guns were positioned to cover likely approach routes. Mortars and artillery pieces were concealed behind ridges and within hardened positions designed to survive bombardment. Natural cave systems across the island offered protection from naval shelling and air attacks, while also providing defenders positions that were difficult to identify from above. The island itself had slowly become a fortress, but Japanese doctrine itself was beginning to change. Earlier battles across the Pacific had often relied on large Banzai attacks and direct resistance near landing beaches. Those tactics had produced enormous casualties while slowing American advances only temporarily. Japanese commanders increasingly realized that future battles would require something different. The goal was no longer immediate destruction of landing forces. The goal was time: force the Americans into prolonged fighting, increase casualties, slow operations enough to make every future invasion more difficult than the last. Saipan would become part of that transition. The objective was no longer simply to stop landings. The objective was to make every mile expensive. American commanders expected fierce resistance, but many still believed Saipan would eventually follow a familiar pattern: bombardment, landings, gradual advance, and victory. What they did not yet understand was that Saipan would become something different, because long before the final days at the cliffs, the battle itself was already beginning to evolve into one of the most costly and psychologically devastating campaigns of the Pacific War. On paper, Saipan looked like another island operation. In reality, events already unfolding there would eventually push thousands of soldiers and civilians toward the northern edge of the island. And the first American landing craft had not even reached the beaches yet. Before dawn on June 15, 1944, American ships already surrounded Saipan in overwhelming numbers. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, transport vessels, landing craft, and carriers stretched across the horizon in every direction. More than 500 ships had gathered offshore as part of the invasion force assembled to seize the island. For days, naval bombardment had already been underway. American battleships fired thousands of shells into suspected Japanese defensive positions across the coastline. Carrier aircraft struck roads, artillery sites, and visible concentrations of troops inland. From the decks of ships waiting offshore, columns of smoke rose from various parts of the island, while explosions flashed across ridges and hills near the landing areas. To many observers, the bombardment appeared devastating. The assumption felt familiar. Heavy naval gunfire had supported previous Pacific landings, and many believed the shelling would severely weaken defenders before Marines reached the beaches. Similar expectations had existed before earlier operations throughout the Pacific. But Saipan was different. Japanese commanders had spent months preparing positions designed specifically to survive bombardment. Rather than concentrating defenses directly at the shoreline, many heavy weapons had been hidden farther inland. Artillery positions were concealed behind terrain features. Cave systems protected soldiers from shell fragments and air attacks. Guns remained hidden during bombardment and waited for the moment the landings actually began. The beaches themselves stretched along the southwestern coastline near Chiran Kanoa. From the sea, they appeared wide and relatively open. Behind them sat sugar fields, roads, and rising terrain extending inland toward hills and defensive positions farther north. As dawn approached, landing craft carrying thousands of Marines began moving toward shore. Inside many of those vehicles, conditions were strangely quiet. Some men adjusted equipment one final time. Others checked weapons repeatedly despite already checking them minutes earlier. Radios crackled with short transmissions. Engines vibrated beneath steel floors as waves pushed landing craft up and down across the water. Most of the men aboard understood where they were going, but almost none understood what waited for them once the ramps dropped. As the first waves crossed coral reefs near the beaches, Japanese artillery suddenly opened fire. The coastline that had appeared almost silent only moments earlier erupted. Shells crashed among approaching landing craft. Water columns exploded upward around amphibious vehicles. Machine gun fire began cutting across sections of the beach as concealed positions finally revealed themselves. Within minutes, the assumptions created by days of bombardment started collapsing. Confusion spread almost immediately along sections of the shoreline. Landing craft struck reefs unexpectedly and were forced to unload farther from shore than planned. Some Marines entered the water carrying equipment weighing more than 70 pounds while attempting to move through incoming fire. Radios failed. Units became separated. Smoke drifting across the beaches reduced visibility while explosions threw sand, dirt, and debris into the air. The first waves continued moving forward anyway. Engineers worked to clear obstacles while medical personnel moved among wounded men near the waterline. Officers attempted to reorganize formations that had become mixed during the approach. Tanks supporting the landing struggled through difficult terrain near the beaches as artillery shells continued landing across the shoreline. Despite the resistance, the size of the American assault itself created a problem the Japanese defenders could not fully solve. There were simply too many landing craft, too many ships, too many men continuing toward the island. Each destroyed vehicle was replaced by another emerging through smoke offshore. Each section of beach under fire received additional reinforcements arriving from the sea. The bombardment that had failed to destroy Japanese defenses had still accomplished one important objective. It had disrupted coordination. And while Japanese defenders continued inflicting casualties, the invasion itself had already survived its most vulnerable moment. Saipan had survived, and thousands of Marines moving toward the beaches were entering a battle far different from the one many expected. The beaches had been secured. The mountains waiting inland had not. By the second day of the invasion, the battle for Saipan had already begun changing. The beaches that had consumed so much attention during planning were no longer the center of the fighting. American forces had secured enough ground to begin pushing inland, expanding the beachhead and moving toward the road systems, villages, and elevated terrain that controlled movement across the island. The battle was now leaving the shoreline behind. Ahead of the Marines stretched sugarcane fields, rocky hills, and terrain that looked deceptively open from a distance. Maps showed roads and objectives clearly enough. Reality looked different. Smoke still drifted across sections of the island from bombardment and burning supply areas. Craters interrupted movement routes. Destroyed vehicles remained scattered across roads and fields, while artillery continued firing intermittently from positions that had not yet been identified. And somewhere farther inland, Japanese defenders were waiting. Unlike earlier Pacific battles where heavy resistance often concentrated near the beaches, Japanese commanders on Saipan increasingly shifted toward defense in depth. Positions had been established farther inland where terrain itself could multiply defensive strength. Every hill became an observation point. Every ridge became a firing position. Every cave could become a bunker. For advancing Marines, uncertainty became almost constant. Movement through sugarcane fields created its own problems. The vegetation often stood higher than the men moving through it, limiting visibility in every direction. Small Japanese positions hidden only a short distance away could remain invisible until firing actually began. Machine gun bursts sometimes erupted from terrain that had appeared empty moments earlier. Mortars landed without warning. Snipers hidden among rocks and vegetation forced units to slow repeatedly while attempting to identify firing positions. The advance became measured not in miles but in small pieces of terrain: a hill, a road, a tree line, a cluster of buildings. Take one position, move forward, repeat. American firepower remained overwhelming whenever targets could be identified. Naval guns offshore continued providing support. Artillery batteries established behind the beaches fired continuously against suspected Japanese locations. Aircraft attacked ridges and defensive positions whenever weather and visibility allowed. But destroying terrain was easier than controlling it. Japanese defenders repeatedly reappeared from caves and concealed positions after bombardments ended. Areas believed secured sometimes produced fresh resistance only hours later. Marines moving forward occasionally discovered that positions thought destroyed had simply remained hidden. The island itself seemed to fight back. Days began blending together for many Marines advancing inland. Morning bombardments were followed by movement through terrain that often looked nearly identical to the ground already crossed the previous day. Heat rose from open areas while humidity soaked uniforms and equipment. Water consumption increased rapidly under tropical conditions, and fatigue began accumulating across units that had been fighting continuously since the landings. Sleep became irregular. Food often arrived late. Small unit engagements happened repeatedly without warning. A section of terrain could appear secure only for isolated gunfire to erupt from a cave entrance or a concealed trench line that had gone unnoticed during earlier fighting. Japanese defenders frequently remained hidden until American troops moved within extremely short distances. Then the shooting began. In some areas, Marines found themselves fighting enemies they could barely see. A burst of machine gun fire from concealed positions could stop movement across an entire section of terrain until artillery, tanks, or flamethrower teams could be brought forward. Progress slowed further. Casualties continued increasing. And while American commanders still possessed overwhelming advantages in artillery, naval support, aircraft, and logistics, those advantages could not completely eliminate one problem: the terrain itself. The deeper the advance moved inland, the more difficult it became to identify where the next defensive position waited, and Japanese commanders understood exactly what that uncertainty could do. By late June, the battle had become slower than many planners originally expected. Farther north, Japanese commanders were already preparing the next phase of the defense, because for them, the objective was no longer victory. The objective was time. And soon thousands of soldiers and civilians would begin moving toward the northern end of Saipan, toward terrain that would later become known around the world for entirely different reasons. As American forces continued pushing north, the landscape of Saipan gradually began changing. The open fields and coastal areas that had dominated earlier fighting slowly gave way to more difficult terrain. Hills became steeper, rocky formations appeared more frequently. Narrow routes between elevated ground restricted movement and created natural choke points capable of slowing entire units. For Japanese commanders, this was exactly where they wanted the battle to move. The farther American forces advanced, the more the terrain itself could be used as a weapon. Mount Tapochau dominated much of the island's central area. Rising above surrounding terrain, it provided observation over large sections of Saipan and became one of the most important positions on the island. Whoever controlled elevated ground there could observe roads, troop movements, artillery positions, and possible avenues of approach. The battle for the surrounding ridges quickly became some of the most difficult fighting Marines had yet encountered. Unlike earlier engagements where enemy positions could sometimes be identified before attacks began, many Japanese defenses here simply disappeared into the landscape itself. Cave openings blended into rock formations. Machine gun positions sat hidden beneath vegetation. Entrances only a few feet wide concealed tunnels extending deep underground. American bombardments continued. Battleships offshore fired heavy shells into mountain positions. Artillery batteries hammered suspected defensive locations for hours at a time. Aircraft dropped bombs against ridges where observers believed Japanese forces were concentrated. Smoke and dust covered entire sections of terrain. Then Marines moved forward, and many times the resistance started again. Positions believed destroyed suddenly reopened fire. Cave systems protected defenders from bombardment while allowing them to emerge after shelling ended. Areas thought secured during the morning occasionally produced fresh attacks later that same day. The battle increasingly became a process of finding individual positions and eliminating them one by one. Progress slowed, casualties climbed. Combat inside some sections of the mountains increasingly turned into close-range fighting measured in yards rather than miles. Advancing units often found themselves climbing steep slopes while attempting to identify positions hidden somewhere above them. A few feet of elevation could provide defenders significant advantages. Japanese soldiers frequently waited until American troops approached extremely short distances before opening fire. The result was confusion that developed rapidly. Flamethrower teams moved forward alongside infantry units. Demolition charges were carried toward cave entrances. Tanks attempted to provide support whenever terrain allowed movement, though narrow routes and rocky surfaces often restricted where armored vehicles could operate. Each cave created its own problem. Some contained only a handful of defenders. Others connected to tunnel systems extending beneath hillsides and ridges. Eliminating one position did not always mean the surrounding area had been secured. Soldiers hidden underground could emerge from entirely different openings later in the day. For many Marines, one of the most frustrating realities of Saipan became the uncertainty itself. There was rarely a visible front line. The enemy often remained unseen, and every step forward created the possibility that another concealed position waited only yards away. The psychological effect also began growing. Marines described uncertainty becoming one of the most difficult parts of the fighting. Open ground felt dangerous. Hills felt dangerous. Rocks felt dangerous. Even silence felt dangerous. Because silence on Saipan often meant something was waiting. Days of fighting had already exhausted many units. Men slept in short periods whenever conditions allowed. Supplies moved forward continuously while wounded personnel moved toward rear areas in the opposite direction. But despite mounting resistance, American pressure continued increasing. Japanese forces continued losing ground. And farther north, General Yoshitsugu Saito was beginning to understand something becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. The island could still delay the Americans, but it might no longer stop them. And once that reality became unavoidable, the final phase of Saipan would begin moving closer. Before we continue, take a moment and let me know in the comments, which Pacific battle do you think became the most brutal of the war? Because for many Marines fighting on Saipan, the worst part of the battle had still not begun. By late June and early July, the battle for Saipan had entered a new phase. American forces continued pushing north, compressing Japanese defenders into increasingly smaller sections of the island. Positions that had once formed a layered defensive system were beginning to collapse under constant pressure from artillery, naval support, aircraft, tanks, and advancing infantry. The available ground itself was disappearing. Japanese commanders had spent weeks attempting to slow the American advance through terrain, cave systems, and attritional fighting. In many areas, those tactics had worked. Casualties continued rising. Progress remained slower than originally expected. But delaying a force and stopping it were not the same thing. Every day, American troops moved farther north. Every day, supply routes expanded. Every day, Japanese defensive space became smaller. For General Yoshitsugu Saito and other commanders on Saipan, the military situation was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Communications had deteriorated, supplies were collapsing, medical facilities struggled to function, ammunition shortages had begun appearing across sections of the island. The possibility of organized resistance continuing indefinitely was disappearing. Yet surrender remained almost unimaginable. Japanese military culture during the war had created an expectation that surrender represented dishonor rather than survival. Years of training, propaganda, and military doctrine had reinforced the belief that capture by enemy forces would result in consequences many soldiers considered worse than death itself. Those beliefs extended beyond military units. Thousands of civilians remained trapped on Saipan. Many had already moved north alongside withdrawing military forces. Families carried limited belongings while moving through damaged roads, caves, and rough terrain. Some searched for food, others searched for missing relatives. Rumors spread rapidly across groups already exhausted by weeks of fighting, and fear spread even faster. Conditions near the northern sections of the island continued deteriorating with each passing day. Caves and temporary shelters became increasingly crowded as more soldiers and civilians moved into shrinking defensive areas. Food supplies had become unreliable. Water shortages began affecting larger groups. Medical treatment for the wounded grew increasingly limited as available equipment and personnel disappeared. Exhaustion had become visible almost everywhere. Many soldiers had been fighting continuously for weeks with little rest. Civilians who had spent days moving through damaged terrain often carried children, personal belongings, or whatever supplies they had managed to keep while retreating northward. Rumors continued spreading among groups already living under extreme pressure. Some believed rescue forces might still arrive. Others believed Japanese reinforcements could somehow break through American naval control surrounding the island. But increasingly, many understood that no help was coming. The island had become isolated, and with every passing day, available choices continued disappearing. Reports describing American forces as brutal or inhuman had circulated long before the invasion began. Some civilians genuinely believed capture meant torture or execution. Many had never encountered Americans before. Many only knew what they had been told. Meanwhile, American forces continued advancing. For Marines moving north, signs of collapse were becoming increasingly visible. Destroyed positions appeared more frequently. Abandoned equipment could be found near former defensive areas. Small groups of isolated defenders continued resisting, but organized resistance across some sectors began weakening. Still, the fighting did not stop. Because even while the battle itself was approaching its conclusion, something else was beginning to form farther north, something many American troops had not yet fully understood. Because for thousands gathered near the northern edge of Saipan, the battle itself was no longer becoming a question of victory. It was becoming a question of what came after defeat. And within days, events there would become some of the most disturbing scenes of the Pacific War. By early July 1944, organized Japanese resistance on Saipan was approaching collapse. American forces had continued advancing north, reducing remaining defensive areas and isolating groups of soldiers across shrinking sections of terrain. Positions that had once formed coordinated defensive systems had become fragmented pockets of resistance scattered among hills, caves, and damaged positions near the northern end of the island. The battle itself had already reached a point where its outcome was becoming increasingly clear. Japan would lose Saipan. For General Yoshitsugu Saito, that reality was becoming impossible to avoid. For weeks, Japanese forces had attempted to slow the American advance through defensive positions designed to maximize terrain and inflict casualties. In many respects, those efforts had succeeded. American losses had risen. Fighting had lasted far longer than some planners originally expected. Entire units had endured exhausting combat across difficult terrain. But delaying an enemy and stopping an enemy were two different things. The available ground had nearly disappeared. Supplies had reached critical levels. Communications had deteriorated further. Thousands of soldiers had already been killed, and among remaining forces, exhaustion had become nearly universal. Inside cave systems and temporary command positions near the northern sections of the island, Japanese commanders faced a reality few wanted to acknowledge openly. There would be no reinforcement force. There would be no rescue operation. No fleet was coming over the horizon. No counterattack would push American forces back into the sea. Saipan had become isolated. For many commanders, only two possibilities appeared to remain: continue resistance until destruction, or surrender. But surrender remained almost unimaginable under wartime military culture. Years of training and doctrine had reinforced the idea that capture represented dishonor. Death itself had often been presented as preferable to becoming a prisoner. That belief extended far beyond military units. Thousands of civilians remained concentrated near the northern sections of the island, many moving alongside retreating Japanese forces. Families continued gathering inside caves and temporary shelters, while artillery and gunfire echoed across nearby terrain. Rumors continued spreading. Some believed American soldiers would torture prisoners. Some believed families would be executed. Others believed unimaginable stories that had circulated long before the invasion even began. Fear increasingly replaced information, and fear often moved faster than reality. Conditions among remaining Japanese forces continued worsening by the hour. Wounded soldiers increasingly outnumbered available medical personnel. Makeshift treatment areas had been established inside caves and sheltered positions wherever space allowed, but medical supplies had become extremely limited. Doctors and medics often faced impossible decisions regarding who could receive treatment and who could not. Food shortages had also become severe. Small amounts of rice, preserved supplies, and whatever food remained available had to be divided among soldiers and civilians already weakened by weeks of fighting. Water became increasingly difficult to obtain in some areas, forcing many groups to survive under conditions that continued deteriorating every day. Fatigue itself had become another enemy. Many survivors had experienced constant artillery fire, bombardments, gunfire, and movement for weeks, with almost no opportunity for proper rest. Physical exhaustion combined with fear and uncertainty began affecting decisions across the remaining defensive areas. Meanwhile, American forces continued pressing forward. Marines advancing north increasingly encountered evidence that Japanese resistance had entered its final stage. Abandoned equipment became more common. Isolated defenders continued fighting from caves and concealed positions, but organized defensive lines had begun disappearing. Yet something unusual also became visible. Groups of soldiers and civilians were moving farther north, away from previous defensive areas. away from positions that still offered protection, toward the cliffs. At first, many Marines did not fully understand what they were seeing, because in military terms it made little sense. The battle itself was ending. But for thousands of people near the northern edge of Saipan, another decision had already begun forming. And during the night of July 6th, events would move toward a final order that would transform the last hours of Saipan into something far more disturbing than a military defeat. During the night of July 6th and into July 7th, the battle for Saipan entered its final phase. For General Yoshitsugu Saito and many remaining Japanese commanders, the military situation had become impossible to reverse. American forces controlled most of the island. Defensive positions had collapsed across large sections of terrain. Supply systems no longer functioned effectively. Communication between isolated groups had deteriorated further. There would be no recovery. There would be no withdrawal. There would be no victory. Only one final action remained. During the final hours of organized resistance, Japanese commanders prepared what would become one of the largest Banzai attacks of the Pacific War. Remaining soldiers, including wounded personnel and troops with limited ammunition, gathered for a final assault against advancing American positions. For many of those involved, survival was no longer a part of the plan. Before dawn, movement began across the northern sections of the island. American soldiers initially detected unusual activity in front of their lines. Small movements became larger movements. Shadows emerging from darkness gradually transformed into something much bigger. Then the attack came. Thousands of Japanese soldiers surged forward. Rifle fire erupted across defensive positions. Machine guns opened immediately. Mortars began firing into advancing formations. Artillery support followed as American units attempted to stop the assault before it reached their positions. But despite devastating fire, the attack continued moving. Wounded soldiers moved alongside others still capable of fighting. Small groups pushed through openings created by confusion and darkness. Some attackers carried rifles while others advanced with whatever weapons remained available. In several areas, fighting collapsed into extremely close-range combat. Lines blurred. Units became mixed. Visibility disappeared beneath smoke, dust, and continuous gunfire. Some American units initially struggled to understand the scale of what they were facing. Reports arriving across radios described large numbers of attackers breaking through sections of defensive lines, while fighting spread across multiple positions at once. The violence developed rapidly. Medical personnel found themselves carrying weapons alongside their normal duties. Drivers, cooks, engineers, and rear support personnel in some areas suddenly became part of the fighting itself as Japanese troops penetrated sections of the American perimeter. The attack continued for hours. Bodies accumulated across sections of terrain while machine gun crews repeatedly changed barrels, overheated by continuous firing. Artillery units fired at extremely close ranges. Individual acts of resistance and small unit fighting began occurring simultaneously across multiple sectors. Eventually, the assault lost momentum. The final organized military resistance on Saipan had effectively ended, but its conclusion did not bring immediate relief. Because while soldiers fought through the final Banzai attack, another tragedy had already begun unfolding nearby. Farther north, near the cliffs overlooking the ocean, thousands of civilians and remaining soldiers had gathered. Many had spent days hearing stories about what they believed would happen if captured. Many had lost contact with relatives. Many had already seen weeks of bombardment, destruction, and retreat, and fear continued replacing reality. American loudspeakers attempted to encourage surrender. Interpreters tried communicating with civilians. Leaflets had been distributed promising humane treatment. Some civilians surrendered, some hesitated. Others remained uncertain. But many had spent years hearing messages that surrender represented humiliation, torture, or death. For some, those beliefs had become stronger than the reality unfolding around them. Because once fear becomes stronger than information, decisions begin changing. And at the northern edge of Saipan, thousands of people were approaching the moment the island would later become remembered for. The Battle for Saipan officially ended in July 1944. For the United States, the island became one of the most important victories of the Pacific War. Airfields constructed there would soon allow American bombers to strike the Japanese home islands directly, changing the course of the war itself. But military success came at an enormous cost. Thousands of American troops had been killed or wounded. Japanese military losses were devastating, and the final days near the northern cliffs of the island left behind images that would remain among the most disturbing memories of the Pacific Campaign. Saipan had begun as a battle for territory. It ended as something larger, a demonstration of how fear, isolation, propaganda, and war itself could continue shaping decisions long after military defeat had already become inevitable. Some battles are remembered for strategy, others are remembered for victory. Saipan became remembered for what happened after hope disappeared. If you enjoyed this documentary, subscribe for more real stories from World War II